That's the sound of your current hype level at the gas pump. But brace yourself for something fuel nominal, because Unleaded 88 is about to take the hype to a whole new level. Unleaded 88 is cheaper, cleaner, and greener than regular unleaded. Plus, it's homegrown, making Unleaded 88 the clear choice at the pump and totally worth the hype. So pump it up with Unleaded 88, brought to you by Iowa Corn.
It's time to get inside the Giants Huddle.
Let's go, let's go, let's go.
On Giants.com.
I like it, I like it.
And the Giants mobile app.
Boom, give me some juice.
Part of the Giants Podcast Network.
Let's roll.
Welcome to another edition of the Giants Huddle Podcast, brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the New York Football Giants. I am John Schmeelk, joined by Matthew Citak as we react to Hard Knocks Episode 3, New York Giants Offseason. Thank you for being with us. Frankly, we would have loved to do this the last 2 weeks, but it's the only 2 weeks that any of us can take vacation. So we were not going to, we have our production people are off, Matt and I were off, a lot of people are off. So we're going to kind of recap what happened in the first 3 episodes today, but really just lock in on free agency stuff. All the great stuff from the combine, you know, the talks with the prospects in the room and stuff like that. Since episode 3 was so heavy on free agency, understandably so, it was free agency week that they recapped. We'll focus on free agency here, and then we'll kind of include all of the draft, Combine, Senior Bowl with the draft, which based on the teaser for next week appears to be the major topic, Matt, in episode 4.
Yeah, they're going to get into the draft. I'm excited to see that. But the first 3 episodes of the show I thought was just truly fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, I know we've gotten accustomed to getting a little bit of an inside look into the offseason with a Giants life the last couple of years, but I feel like this kind of just takes it to another level just because it's expanded episodes, 5, 30 to 45 minute episodes. It just gives us this fascinating inside look into how everything truly goes down in the front office. Things that, we've never actually seen before. I mean, the movie Draft Day happens to be one of my favorite sports movies just because I love the sort of behind the scenes look it gives you. And this Hard Knocks offseason show is a real life version of that, except it spans the entire offseason and not just, one single day. And seeing how Joe Schoen and the front office had built a plan to construct the roster. And, tonight's episode 3 was the free agency, the first week of free agency. And we got to see them really start putting that plan into action for real. It was just so cool and interesting to see.
I will not give my draft day dissertation. I think I've given it to you before. Have I given you my draft day dissertation before?
So.
By the way, my good friend, who actually I tried to call right before the show, he is one of the talk show hosts that they have in the show.
Really?
Talking about, because he's a real ESPN morning show in Cleveland, and they used him and his partner to do the commentary, like when you're listening to the radio in the car. That's him doing the thing. Wow. Aaron Goldhammer, who joined us for the Browns preview. So if you're a draft day fan, that's him. He was on our show a couple weeks ago previewing the Browns if you want to check that out. So you talked about how they prepared for free agency. Episode 3 was the execution of free agency. Before we get into that, Matt, I do think it's interesting how we saw with the first 2 episodes, this group put their free agency board together where they really take players, and we didn't see them really do this in order per se, but we kind of saw them flash back and talk about the process, the guys they liked, how much they're going to cost, and then basically putting the jigsaw puzzle together based on what the offseason would look like. And they talked about, and Joe Schoen, I think he said this to Brian Dable in the meeting with him, you basically have a pie, which is the money you have available to your organization to spend, which ended up being a little bit more because the salary cap went up more than everyone expected. And how do you split up that money in a way that improves your team the most? I like to use a term production per dollar, right? You want to maximize the amount of production per dollar you spend. You want to improve your team as much as you can per dollar you spend. And I thought it was interesting how they really have walkaway numbers on each guy and have all these different scenarios, which eventually, as we learned in episode 3, is out of your control. But how much they really detail each player. This is the number. This is our walkaway number. This is what we think he's going to earn. And you know what? Sometimes you end up being way off on some of those numbers, to be honest with you. That's the way free agency goes to the market.
Yep.
But I did appreciate kind of the level of granularity and detail that they went into in trying to put that plan together.
Yeah, I mean, it was very cool to see them sort of go through these discussions of, we can go for player A, but then we won't be able to afford player B, or we can go for
or maybe even player B and C sometimes.
Or player B and C, but that means we have to skip out on player A. That was just very, very cool to see. And tonight's episode, as you mentioned, was really how got into the execution of their actual plan. And obviously now we're months after free agency. We know how everything ended up happening, but we didn't know exactly how it went down. We didn't know, how the Giants ended up signing John Runyon and Jermaine Illuminor and what other, possible offensive linemen they were interested in. And the same goes for, every position that the Giants attacked during free agency. The Brian Burns part, the first 2 episodes of the show, they've obviously previewed the Brian Burns trade. We've seen it, it started at the Senior Bowl with, this little throwaway comment from Panthers GM Dan Morgan, which turned into an actual trade.
It was like starting to boil water, right? You put the flame on and the water just gets a little bit hotter, then eventually it boils and then you're able to figure out the trade.
Yeah, and I mean, going back to even that first episode when Dan Morgan first said that line, like, how about Brian Burns for 2 ones? You heard Joe Shane go, oh, like he was not expecting to hear that. And that was the first time that Joe Shane probably heard Brian Burns is on the market. You come in with a strong offer, we are fully willing to listen and accept the deal to give you Brian Burns. And that was, truly just, I'm going to keep saying, but just fascinating to see.
Yeah.
That's how some of these trade negotiations truly begin.
I agree. I thought it was fun. And, you already brought it up, so why don't we touch on that first, and then I'll go on to one more thing before we jump to the retro free agency. I think it's also interesting how far the Panthers moved off what the initial float was. Because first it was 2 ones, and Joe Shane's like, oh, Brian Burns, but yeah, you're nuts. You ain't getting 2 ones, right? I think that was kind of what that kind of like sounds that he was making on the field at the Senior Bowl, right? Yeah. And then, well, how about a 1 and something else? And Joe's like, oh, well, you're getting closer. And eventually there were no ones involved at all. It was a high 2, and then I think, they swapped 140 and 165, and then a pick next year, right?
5th round pick, 2025.
So just how much you have to hold your ground and be patient, or even if you're excited, oh wow, I want this guy, he'd be great for us, I want to bring him in. Now of course at the Senior Bowl, I don't even think Bowen was here yet at that point yet, right? Shane Bowen, he had not been hired yet at that point, if I'm not mistaken. I don't believe so. So at that point, you're not going to make a deal that early because you don't even know who your GC is, if he's going to want the player. But eventually you find that, and we saw that when they were in the suite at the Combine, when they asked Shane Bowen, oh, what do you think of Brian Burns? He's like, I could use Brian Burns. He has that little smile on his face, right?
I think the quote was like, I'd be good with Brian Burns.
Correct. And it's just funny how much that you had to work them down from that initial offer to get him. It's like when you're shopping, right? Or you're on the internet, you're looking at Amazon, you're like, boy, I really want to buy this thing. But you got to be patient. You got to wait for the sale to happen, right? Amazon deal day is coming. You just have to wait. You have to wait for it to pop the sale before you place the purchase. It's kind of the same thing when you're trying to make these trades, right? You got to try to get them at the lowest price you possibly can.
Yeah, and I mean, based off of that first comment that Dan Morgan made at the Senior Bowl, well, we don't know if he was being serious, saying that he actually thought they'd get 2 firsts for Brian Burns.
Last year,
that was what they got offered by I think it was the Rams, who reportedly offered them 2 first-round picks a year ago, and they turned it down. So I guess that is where Dan Morgan likely, that thought first came from. But you have to give it up to Joe Shane, because if that was what Carolina was originally thinking, oh, maybe we can get this for Brian Burns, and Joe Shane ended up giving up a 2, a 5, and then a swap of 5s, moving down 26 picks. That is a tremendous job by Joe Shane.
And think of the spot Dan Morgan was in. I know we're spending more time on this than we probably planned, but that's okay. Last year, he was not the GM. Scott Fitterer was, right? Yep. And they let go of Scott Fitterer. He got replaced. So you then, and we saw this when they eventually pulled the trigger on the trade, Dan Morgan had to go to his owner, David Tepper, to get an approval of the trade. And they had apparently, based on what we saw on the phone, they had a couple different versions of this trade, whether it was 39 or 47, right? I think was the Giants' second round pick, right? And how much you would get with each one of those. And he had to go check with David Tepper, and it turns out being 5 hours, 6 hours. They're waiting. Other guys are getting signed. And it just shows you that I'm sure the owner remembered when his GM came to him at the trade deadline last year and said, hey, this team offered us 2 ones for Brian Burns. So you know what that owner's thinking now? Well, I got an offer for 2 ones last year. that's what I want to get now. So I'm sure that was probably, honestly, put yourself in Dan Morgan's shoes. That was probably a tough sell for Dan Morgan to his owner, that you're getting just this, when last year the owner knew that we got an offer of 2-1s for the guy. I'm sure that was a tough sell for him, to be honest with you.
Yeah, definitely. But I mean, as you mentioned, I guess there's a reason why Dan Morgan is the new GM in Carolina. I mean, talk about what the Panther situation was last year as much as you want, but 2 firsts for Brian Burns last year, considering what they gave up. Probably that was a deal that they should have taken.
No, he wasn't on the tag last year. He's on the tag now, right?
True.
So,
but, great for the Giants that it turned out how it did.
Absolutely.
The Giants now have Brian Burns paired with Kayvon Thibodeau, Dexter Lawrence. Could end up being one of the top pass rushing lines in the NFL. I mean, that's certainly the hope.
You're ready for a change. Payday comes early with Citizens, so go to that retreat. New you moves to the country. Now you're raising goats and launching a lifestyle brand. Are you ready for all that life brings?
now, and the Burns trade, even though it didn't happen first, Matt, ended up kind of being the linchpin to the offseason plan, right? Just because that took up most of the cap space, right? And the way the Giants are going about this. And, in the show, this was in an interview with Joe Shane on the side. He's like, look, we're sitting there and we're waiting to say yes to this trade, and we're watching all these other free agents get signed by other teams. And if the Panthers then trade them somewhere else or decide not to do the trade at all, you're sitting there with all this cap space. David McKinney got signed by somebody else, right? Saquon Barkley's got signed by somebody else. We'll talk about those guys too. There's no one left to spend money on. Now, Christian Wilkins, I believe, if I remember correctly, did get signed after the Burns trade. He was later in the week, so and his name had been mentioned previously in the first couple episodes. They could have always pivoted there if they wanted to for another big money free agent. But, signing Burns is what basically, and they said this to Shane Bowen, if you get Burns, you ain't getting anybody else. Like, dude, that's it. And they asked him, Shane Bowen's like, I'd love you hate to go. He's like, can I go in there? He's like, knocking on the door. Can I come in? He didn't know who Jay Shane was talking to. Obviously, want to just barge in on the GM. And they're like, all right, you like Burns? He goes, yeah, I like Burns. He's like, but that's it. Like, it's almost like you're talking to your kid about his Christmas list. He's like, I want a PlayStation 5. And you're like, all right, that's all you're getting though, kid. Like, this could be one present under that tree. That's it. You ain't getting anything else. Are you sure? Yeah, I want the PlayStation 5. and that's basically what Bowen was like for Brian Burns.
Yeah, it definitely was. And I mean, honestly, it makes sense. I mean, we've talked at length over the last couple months since the trade about how Brian Burns is just a perfect fit for the Giants with Shane Bowen's defense. So it doesn't surprise me at all that Shane Bowen was fully willing to sign off on Brian Burns being basically the only defensive acquisition, at least for more than, reportedly numbers of minimum or around the minimum.
And that's basically what it ended up being when all was said and done too. I mean, that's what it was.
Yeah. And I mean, clearly once Shane Bowen was brought in, it was very obvious that edge rusher was one of the top priorities for the Giants this offseason. It wasn't, I would say, probably not the number one priority, which we'll get to right after this, but it was clear that it was right up there. I mean, there was one comment Joe made in tonight's episode saying, okay, if we don't get Burns at this point, we'll go and turn towards the draft to try to get an edge rusher. Right. So it was clear that one way or another, they were adding someone to that position that they felt could either be a starter or, big rotation player right away. I don't know if they would have, considered an edge rusher with the 6th overall pick.
Probably not.
Probably not, as we saw the first defensive player didn't get selected until, was it pick 15 or 16?
39 or 47, though. You want to go move up. Easier to move up to get one of these guys,
Yeah, that is true. But it was clear that edge rusher was one of the top priorities. And, we discussed before coming to film this, the quote that Brian Daboll said to Joe Shane. Well, Joe Shane originally sent a text to Brian Daboll. And then towards the end of tonight's episode, Brian Daboll, while on a FaceTime with Joe Shane, I guess resent the text back to Joe to remind him. And it said, protect the quarterback and get after the quarterback. And clearly that was the two biggest priorities of the offseason. And looking back, that's exactly what they ended up doing.
Football season is coming, and so is the next college semester. If you need funding, a Citizen student loan could help you pay for 100% of your school-certified costs. Get your rate quote in about 2 minutes at citizensbank.com/pay-for-college. Yes, 100%, and that ended up being what they did, and we saw earlier in the episode. And I don't know how close to free agency this conversation took place between Joe Schoen and Brian Dable, but they were sitting in Joe's office. There was some music playing as Brian Dable spoke about it, the Giant 100 thing. But they ended up incorporating it. The song actually made sense with the show, and they actually ended up using it. It actually was, I got to give the producers and editors for films really well done there, guys.
Was this when the Beyonce song came on?
No, it was the Know When to Hold, Know When to Fold 'Em, right? In the beginning of the episode,
I guess they did it twice then. There were two different scenes where you could see like Joe or Brian put on a song.
What was the one where like Joe turned it up? I thought that was a Know When to Hold, Know When to Fold 'Em, or am I remembering that wrong?
I just remember one of the songs being Beyonce's new country hit song.
Oh, you know what? You might be right. And then I think maybe they transitioned from that into the Know When to Hold 'Em, Know When to Fold 'Em.
That might have been it.
I think you're right. So, yeah. So they're talking about it, and Joe tries to nail Dave's down. He's like, look, if there's one thing that's your top priority in free agency, what would it be? And Dable seems to, not hem and haw, but think about it for a while and eventually says, look, offensive line. And we had seen the conversation between Joe and his staff about it, I think, in a previous episode, and they kind of came down to the same thing too, right? We got to protect the quarterback.
Yep.
And the funny thing, Matt, is even though, and we kind of talked about that too, right? This offseason, that being the top priority. And we kind of assumed, and I assumed that, okay, that means they're going to aim for all these guys at the top of the market. If it's top priority, you go after the best guys, right? Well, the way the Giants had these guys graded out maybe is not the way they eventually got paid in free agency, right?
Yep.
Like they talked about a couple times they mentioned it, that Illuminor was the top guy on their list. Now, whether that they didn't specify, was that from their pro personnel guys, was that from their coaches, was that from Brasillo? They didn't put a name to that, but some evaluation in the building had him as their most important guy in the offensive line to get. And they referred to Illuminor as, and I believe that was Chris Rossetti that said this in the conversation, he's going to be either our starting left guard, which they already had him at a left guard instead of right guard during this conversation, or their starting right tackle. And we talked about it with Michael Onwenu in that way, heading into free agency, where you want a guy that can be the backstop for Neal or be your starting guard.
Yeah.
And that's why I think Illuminor was so important to them. And then they had Runyon and Robert Hunt kind of on their card as the other, I guess it would be right guard then in that case, right? And they had Hunt from anywhere between 13 and 16 or 13 and 15 million, and they had Runyon in that 9 to 10 million area. Hunt ended up going for upwards of $20+ million per year, which I think a lot of people were surprised by that, by the way. That wasn't just the Giants. I think that was probably off of their scale in terms of what they thought he was going to make. And they ended up having to go a little bit above the money that they had delineated for both Illuminor and Runyon. They talked about Illuminor, the walkaway number being 6. They ended up going to 7 because they had competition, I believe they said, with the Cardinals for him.
Yep.
And then Runyon competition with the Jets. They had to go over the top of the Jets up to $10 million in order to get that deal done, according to the show. So I thought it was very interesting that, those were the guys that were important to them. And they asked Dave's like, you're good with Runyon? He's like, yeah, I'm good with Runyon. So it's the conversation and the working together with the GM and the coaches, along with then his personnel staff, to get the right guy that not only guys that the scouts want, but also guys that the coaches want and want to utilize. And even though it wasn't two guys at the top of the market, heck, Runyon and Illuminor made less combined than some of the highest paid offensive linemen for agency, right? Yeah. But it was a priority to protect the quarterback, and they targeted those. Those are 2 of the 3 guys they had on their target list, at least according to how the show was put together. And they ended up with 2 of the 3 guys for right close to the price range they wanted. Again, they maybe went a little bit above to close the deal, but to your point, for agency, the salary cap went up. So they ended up getting 2 of the 3 guys that they really wanted.
Yeah, I don't remember if it was the first episode, the second, or maybe both of them, but I feel like those 3 players, Runyon, Illuminor, and Hunt, the design with the cards that they keep on showing throughout free agency, those 3 guys have been the 3 offensive linemen that the show has been sort of highlighting as possibilities for the Giants since the first episode. I believe it was the first episode. So clearly those were three of the guys towards the top, if not at the top, of the Giants' wish list for the position. Now, you're right that they gave those, dollar amounts. Hunt, I believe, was 13 to 15. Runyon, I think, was 8 to 9, and Illuminor 5 to 6. But those numbers that they gave earlier in the show, that was before they found out that the salary cap was going to be higher than expected. With the salary cap increase, I think at some point in the last episode, Joe mentioned all of the numbers for the guys that they had kind of earmarked. All of them were not all, but a lot of them were probably going to be a little bit more than what they originally expected.
Everyone in the country should be familiar with inflation at this point over the past few years. It's basically what it is, right? Guys, inflation happens. You have too few goods and too much money to spend on them, right? Well, what happens when the cap goes up? You have more money to spend, but there are fewer goods and services to sell. All the prices are going to go up. That's how inflation works.
Yeah. But, I mean, as you mentioned, they were able to sign John Runyon and Jermaine Illuminor, I believe, for less combined money than what Robert Hunt ended up getting.
Absolutely.
By a couple $1 million less. Few other interesting things I thought about those players in particular. When it came to John Runyon, the team that they were competing against the most was the New York Jets. And I believe they said that the Jets came in with a 2-year deal, I want to say for
$9 million.
Yeah, for $18 million total. 2 years, $18 million total, with almost all of it guaranteed.
17
of the 18 guaranteed. And the Giants were able to get Runyon to come to East Rutherford instead by offering him that third year. They matched the guaranteed money that the Jets offered. They added a third year and added the yearly average. Added a little bit more to that. So it was, I believe, it was 3 years, and he's getting around $10 million per year. That's what it came out to. So that's how they beat the Jets offer. And it was just interesting that one of the front office executives mentioned this at one point, that the Giants and Jets were in on a lot of the same free agents.
I think Brandon Brown.
It might have been
I
Brandon
think Brandon
Brown.
might have said that one.
Yeah. That was just, something interesting. I feel like the last couple of years, even whether it was the draft or free agency, the Giants have had a lot of overlap with the Jets, with the players that they were targeting. So that was interesting to note. And then the other thing with Jermaine Illuminor was, so they offered him the 2-year deal, and they said that Arizona offered him a 2-year deal for, I believe it was 2 years, $6 million a year.
Yeah, it sounds right.
Around that?
I'm not sure if they gave that actual number, but then Ed Triggs, who's one of the salary cap guys, said, look, if we go to this, we'll get him.
Yeah, but what I thought was interesting was, I believe it was Joe said, how about we go to a third year? And I believe it was Triggs said he only wants 2 years. He wants a 2-year deal.
Yeah, he did say that.
So I just thought that was interesting because...
And he wanted more money in the first year than in the second. He wanted more money up front in the first year of the contract, too. That was the other thing that I think Illuminor wanted.
And they mentioned, I think, that the second year of Illuminor's contract has barely any or no guaranteed money.
Correct.
But I just thought it was interesting that, a player like Illuminor, who kind of has been somewhat of a journeyman, hasn't gotten, that big long-term deal previously in his career, that he didn't want a 3-year deal. He wanted 2 years, and then clearly he wants to be able to go back on the market in 2 years from now, and obviously the hope would then be to sign another larger contract even that he just got. But
you hit it.
Just when it came to Runyon and Illuminor, I thought that was pretty noteworthy and interesting.
Yeah, and I thought just generally, and then we'll get to the rest of the offensive guys here, how you saw Joe Schoen utilize his staff. Clearly, I think you're seeing kind of his top 2 lieutenants, Tim McDonald and Brandon Brown, were in there with him a lot. Then you have Chris Rossetti, who's obviously big with he's their pro personnel director, so he was in there for a lot of the free agency stuff. Dennis Hickey, you haven't seen him talk much yet. He was the white-haired gentleman with the glasses. He didn't say much here because he's their college scouting guy.
Yeah.
So he's in the meetings, but he's not going to, unless he's asked, put in a lot of 2 cents on the free agency stuff. That's not his expertise. And then you have the salary cap guys who work with the negotiations in the cap. That's Kevin Abrams, who's been here for a very long time, does a great job on the contracts and the salaries. And then Ed Triggs, who works with Kevin. You could say that, look, Joe basically tells those guys, here's what we're willing to offer. They'll get on the line with the agent, talk it through, and then they'll be told whether or not the deal is done. Then they'll go to Joe Schoen and tell him. So besides the Saquon Barkley, direct negotiations with Ed Berry, Saquon's agent, which obviously that's a little bit more fraught with things and how you handle it because of the star power. It's interesting how, that staff comes together to make those decisions, and then ownership's involved in that too, with John Mara coming down and basically giving his opinion. And, he cares about it from a football perspective, but, he has a bigger picture ownership perspective too.
Yep.
what the fans think of these players. Who's our most popular player? Kind of more of that, almost more how fans think about it in some ways, the big picture, seeing everything, not just the micro of the football stuff. And Joe Schoen takes his input. But as we saw in the show, Joe Schoen's going to do what he wants. John Mara said, I'm going to have a tough time sleeping if Saquon Barkley signs with the Eagles. Well, John Mara had a tough time sleeping because Saquon Barkley ended up signing with the Eagles. So I thought it was interesting seeing how everybody's input came in together. But Joe Schoen eventually made the decision, but he utilizes all the skills and takes in all the opinions of the people there, and then he eventually makes the final decision.
Yeah, I feel like the last 2 years since Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll arrived in the building, there's been a lot of talk about this collaborative effort. And, we've seen it within the coaching staff. And, Brian Daboll, some of the coordinators, position coaches, they've all discussed the collaborative approach that the coaching staff takes. And we've also heard about the collaboration between the front office and the coaching staff. And we've, Joe and Brian, they've both spoke about it at length at various times over the last 2+ years, how they really work together, have all of these long, in-depth conversations before free agency, before the draft. And that sort of communication obviously is what you need and want to see from a front office and a coaching staff. But we haven't really seen a collaborative effort within the front office. Not that it hasn't been going on. We just haven't really been given a chance or an opportunity to actually see it. And this was the first time that we did. I mean, Joe Schoen could have negotiated with John Runnion's agent himself. He could have negotiated with Devin Singletary's agent himself. But instead, he gave those duties to some of his top guys below him and trusted them to get the deal done. And they did that on numerous occasions. And so I just think it was interesting and sort of, I guess, refreshing to see that collaboration that we've been hearing about for 2+ years now, it's going on all over the building, from the front office, within just the front office, within just the coaching staff, and then between the two as well.
No question about it. And even our PR maven, Deion Darty, in the room for some of those things. Apparently, only big deals get made when Deion's in the room. He did a great job with that. Sorry, Deion.
You love turf. You're good at it. So you start a turf biz. Business grows, your savings grow. Become the most celebrated name in turf. Are you ready for all that life brings?
A couple of the guys on offense, and then we'll talk about the guys that got away a little bit here, Matt. I thought the quarterback thing was interesting. Yeah. I don't think this had been reported by anyone else before we got to this, by any of the guys that cover the team. But Tyrod was clearly their number one backup quarterback choice. They wanted to bring him back. They even increased their offer enough. The Jets ended up going over the top on them to $9 million a year, and the Giants just couldn't get there. Which, again, given all the money that you end up giving Burns. And by the way, the other thing with Burns, too, they had to make sure he was good with the contract to sign before you can even then make the trade. So that was the other part of that whole thing that was interesting. You have to talk to his agent first, make sure he's good with the extension, before then you can try to finalize the details of the trade with the Panthers. But clearly Tyrod was their top choice, and then they had to pivot. Because they frankly didn't have a ton of money. Ed Triggs had the line talking to, I'm guessing it was an agent on the phone or something like that. Look, we're in aisle 1 right now, and that has a certain amount of price value on it. We can't leave aisle 1. So if one of your guys wants to sign for aisle 1 money, we're here. But otherwise, we're kind of out of money here. And I think to an extent, the backup quarterback, though, I think maybe they were aisle 1/2. Fit into that. So once Tyrod left, they bring in Drew Lock. And the other thing that I thought was pretty obvious in all the conversations about both Tyrod and Drew Lock, and even when they eventually made the deal, I forget if it was Joe Schoen that said it or Ed Triggs said it to him, we have our backup quarterback. Yes. And he said, yes, we have our backup quarterback.
Backup.
So now, we're going to see next week, I'm sure there's going to be talks about whether or not you trade up for a quarterback, and that's a different conversation, right? But for the matter of the free agency part of this, they were looking to sign a backup quarterback. And again, maybe this is where there's the whole report that John Schneider said Drew Lock left because he said he'd get a starting spot. Joe Schoen did say, look, we're going to sell this to Drew Lock by saying, look, Tyrod just got a big raise from being with us last year to this year. When we were in Buffalo, who was the player? Yeah, Mitch Trubisky ended up getting a big raise after being in our system with us, right? And, Daniel Jones is coming off a big ACL. So Drew Lock was going to be the number one quarterback through all the spring, which ended up being the case. He was the number one quarterback for most of the reps in the spring. So the bottom line is that they were bringing a guy not to take the starting job. They're bringing a guy to be the backup quarterback, which I know there's been some debate and conversations about that. But I thought, based on what we saw in Hard Knocks, that really seems to be what the case was here.
Yeah, and I thought it was, when it comes to the quarterbacks, the veteran quarterbacks, the same thing that I mentioned earlier about the offensive linemen with Runyon, Hunt, and Illuminor. They kept on showing throughout the series, the first few episodes, the same kind of group of quarterbacks in terms of who the Giants could be interested in the veteran backups. There was Tyrod, of course, which, as we saw in tonight's episode, there clearly was a lot of interest in bringing him back, but the Jets just ended up offering, a little bit more money. There was Gardner Minshew, who they believed would sign somewhere between $10 to $20 million, and he ended up getting 2 years, $25 million from the Las Vegas Raiders, with, I believe, $15 million of that guaranteed. So clearly, that was more money than what Tyrod got, so that was too pricey for what the Giants were looking for, because again, we're talking a backup quarterback here. So then it seemed like it was coming down to either Drew Lock or Sam Darnold.
And they even mentioned Joe Flacco at some point, too.
They did mention Joe Flacco.
Joe Shane did, yeah.
Yes, they did. But they decided to go with Drew Lock, who they signed to, I believe it was a 1-year deal. Did they say the money? 1 year?
4, I think. Right?
4 or
I think
5 million?
Somewhere in that area.
Yeah. So they ended up giving Drew Lock around.
And all these numbers on contracts, by the way, are unofficial, just so fans understand that.
Yeah. So Drew Lock ended up getting around the money that they projected him to get. And they mentioned, one of the reasons why they were interested in Drew Lock, he's young, he's got a strong arm. And they kind of mentioned, and, Hard Knocks showed the clip of that game-winning touchdown pass he threw against the Eagles on Monday Night Football?
Sunday Night Football? That in
Prime
Jigba,
time.
Right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to Jackson Smith-Njigba in the corner of the end zone. Just an absolute beautiful pass. And then they showed Drew in the draft room upstairs, signing his contract. One of our social media team members, Christina Sinofsky, made her appearance on Hard Knocks.
So did Jen. Jen with the camera, too.
So did Jen, yeah. That was cool to see. But yeah, I mean, they were interested in bringing in a veteran quarterback. Joe made that very clear at the very start of the offseason when he said, we're going to bring in some sort of veteran quarterback, and then basically we'll see about the draft. And it's exactly what he ended up doing.
Absolutely. I'm still waiting for Pearson to make his appearance on Hard Knocks. We have not had Pearson. Have you seen yourself yet? Have you kept your eye open? Have you seen him? Have you seen yourself yet or no?
No, but I think I am in the top 100 players thing this week.
Oh, very good.
Just doing the slate.
Nice.
Oh, yes, I did see you in that.
Very good. I've only spotted myself on Hard Knocks once. It was actually in the opening scene at Saquon's farewell press conference at the end of the day in the wide shot. I'm standing right there taking notes. But I don't think I've seen you in it.
I have not made it yet. I have basically one hope, and it's probably going to be the last episode when they start showing some of the spring practices. That practice that Malik Neighbors made the 2 incredible touchdown catches.
You and Dan were standing right there for that.
If they show him, it was right in front of us. That's my main hope of making the show.
And I think I did see a big tan blur in the corner of the screen once. I think that was the Tino. I'm not sure though.
Running stride for stride with Malik Neighbors down the sideline.
He might be. All right, 2 final topics. I know we're going long, Pearson. I'm sorry. Yeah, we're wrapping up. I know. Running back, they kind of headed down to Devin Singletary and DeAndre Swift.
Yep.
I think they had Singletary at $5 million and Swift at $6 million. That's what they kind of threw at Brian Dable. Swift ended up going for, I think, just over $8 million per year.
3 years, 24
and change, I think, exactly. So they ended up getting Singletary exactly where they wanted him, and Brian Dable was good with that. And then comes back to Saquon and even McKinney, and I think we can, we've seen the Saquon thing play out over 3 weeks, where they ended up just being too expensive. I think they were willing to bring Saquon back at a certain number, and even the number that the agent ended up giving Joe Shane, and Joe Shane basically said that was going to end up being, he probably wasn't going to go that high anyway, and he ended up getting a little bit north of that even when he finally signed with the Eagles. And I think generally speaking, we saw with Swift, who got more too, and I was surprised. I said this on Big Blue Kickoff when free agency took place. The running backs this year, I think, went for more than what a lot of people thought. And maybe that was because of the increased cap, to your point earlier. For whatever reason, a lot of these running backs went for a little bit more than I thought people thought. They went earlier in the market. And I think the Giants just prioritize someone like Brian Burns for that amount of money rather than, spending on Saquon and then McKinney. And you could see the surprise kind of in Joe Shane's voice and of the people in the room when they found out McKinney ended up basically being the second highest paid safety in football. after he signed that contract. Maybe it was after Minka and then maybe Bates. I think maybe Bates.
I think they said he was the number
second,
two.
right? I think
Number
you're
two
right.
highest paid.
But he was right around that number 2 spot. So they had to allocate. We talked about the pie at the start of this episode, right? And they decided they'd rather take that money and pie it out for Brian Burns than to, and the offensive line, quite frankly, which is also their priority, protect the quarterback, get after the quarterback, than a safety and a running back. And I think that's kind of what it came down to.
Yeah, and when it comes to the running backs, I remember in the second episode, Joe mentioned, we're going to try to bring Saquon back, but if he doesn't, I think there's some good value in sort of the second wave of free agent running backs. And I think he even mentioned Devin Singletary in that, second wave after the big name guys that are signing for, the top of the market value. Then there's the next group, and Singletary was in that group. The Giants ended up agreeing to a deal with Devin Singletary on the first day of free agency. And I just thought it was interesting that despite signing early, they still were able to get him for the same amount of money that they projected him to go for.
Yeah, but
it's not like they had to overpay or pay more than they were expecting in order to lock him down to the deal.
If I remember right, Swift might have been the first player to sign in all of free agency. I think he was
one
the
of the
first guy.
Yeah.
And he went, to your point, day one, first guy. You're probably going to have to pay a premium for that, which the Bears, right? The Bears did.
Yep.
So you're right. To get on day one Singletary that number, it's a great deal.
Yeah. I mean, I remember after, I think it was last week's episode, I saw some people on Twitter being like, oh, well, Joe said he was going to wait until the second wave for running back, and then he didn't. He attacked it day one. Well, it's because they were able to get the guy they wanted for the exact money that they wanted. They didn't have to overpay. The whole point of waiting till the second wave is to try to get value and get guys for a little bit cheaper than they were hoping to sign for. But if you have a guy that's willing to sign for exactly what you want to give him right away, why risk waiting to try to lower that number very, very slightly and risk him potentially signing with another team?
Especially since Swift, Pollard, Barkley, all those guys were gone early on day one. So Derrick Henry was still left. I don't think the Giants were going to go for an older running back. So a lot of the running backs were gone. So at that point, even though it was the first day, it was almost like it was the second wave already because all the top guys had been signed. So you were into that second group already. Exactly. And then again, just on Saquon, the whole thing, didn't make an offer. Look, Saquon knew what the Giants were willing to pay him. They went through a year of negotiations the year before. Like, the agent knew. Joe Shane knew what he was going to offer. They've exchanged numbers for a year on this. So I didn't take that seriously. Saquon and the agent did go back to the Giants, and they gave him a number to see if the Giants would match. Now, there was a lack of a commitment that if the Giants matched, he was coming. It wasn't like, all right, you pay us this, we're here. Joe made that point. There was some hemming and hawing there. And then just as for McKinney, I think they thought he was a good player. It just, didn't match for what they wanted to do team building wise. So those are all my thoughts, Matt. Any other final thoughts before we say goodbye here?
No, I think we just about covered all of it.
This was fun.
It was fun. I'm looking forward to doing it again next week.
Yeah, next Wednesday, folks. Check it out. Pearson's going to be busy. We want to make sure we work him to the bone as soon as he's back from vacation. A lot of podcasts coming on the Giants Huddle feed the next 2 weeks. We'll be continuing with Big Blue Kickoff as well. So make sure you check that out. And don't forget, Giants Huddle Podcast was brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the New York Football Giants. Football season is coming. So is the next college semester. If you need funding, a Citizens student loan could help you pay for 100% of your school certified costs. Get your rate quote in about 2 minutes at citizensbank.com/pay-for-college. The top 100 podcasts are populating on the Giants Huddle feed. Make sure you check that out. And this week and next week, we're going to have linebackers, corners, safeties on our position series. We'll finish that off. We'll have Marcus Kuhn coming up as well, talking about the Giants season and the connection with Germany now moving forward for the Giants organization. And if you haven't, folks, go back, check out our position series with all the offensive guys and the defensive linemen. Really invaluable stuff from these players. I think you and Dan are going to write those up at some point, too, to get them on the website. So make sure you check those out on the Giants Huddle Podcast. On your favorite podcast platform, just search for Giants Huddle Podcast on the Giants app. And for the videos of all these podcasts, go check out the Giants YouTube channel as well. We'll see you next time, everybody.